Uh, Could we move up to the front a bit? We're section 5, and we're going to be a kind of a sub-community here. Each section, our section has 7 tracks. So, we are going to get to know each other by the time we spend 8 sessions together besides our plenary. So it is a little hard to see who's out there. Yeah, I suppose we could get you all up here on the stage, actually. Okay, I think we'll start here. My name is Charlene Shearhart, and I actually live with John Cobb and 358 other people at Pilgrim Place. And myself and Angela Donnelly have been ordained by John to be with this section 5, and we've been communicating around this for about a year and a half now, so it's very nice to see you all here. And section 5 has 7 different tracks, and you'll all be in tracks, so that's how it goes. So Angela, unfortunately, cannot be with us these days. She did send her greetings, and both Angela and I appreciate all the hard work that the planning team has gone into in shaping the tracks. All of the coordinators of your various tracks have done a lot of work to bring us to today, and we thank them all. We also know that we are confident that the fruits of this time together will be both satisfying for all of you and appreciated by others who will benefit from your insights and our orientation to climate action. So the plenary today, we're really honored to have Sandra Lubarsky, who will also be leading one of the tracks. And I'd like to just give a brief introduction to our coordinator this morning for the plenary. Sandra chairs the Goodnight Family Sustainable Development Department at the Appalachian State University in North Carolina. For most of her time in the academy, she has been involved in efforts to bring the conversation on sustainability into higher education. She currently writes on process thought and aesthetics, recently publishing essays on beauty in Keeping the Wild, Utne Reader, The Energy Reader. Sandra holds a PhD from Claremont Graduate University. Please welcome our plenary director, Sandra Lubarsky. Oops.
Well, welcome everyone. It's really an honor to be here and to give this presentation, and I really am delighted to welcome all of you here. I do want to give particular thanks to Charlene and Angela, who couldn't be here, who have been organizers for this particular conference section, and I know they've been working for months and months to get us to this point, so thank you, Charlene. And also I want to thank Dr. Meijin Fan, who has made it possible for this presentation to be simultaneously translated into Chinese. I am not going to speak Chinese, so thanks for the translation. The topic of this plenary is what can we hope for? And it's another way of framing the theme of the conference, which is dedicated to finding and seizing strategies that give reason for hope and also generate hope. I am, however, compelled, if I can find the clicker, yes? To start us with the slide, okay. That is going to situate my thoughts on this sober context of our climate crisis, but how do I get this thing going? Yeah. That's the first slide there. This is why I don't teach online courses.
There's only video in black. I'm copying, but there's only video in black. Okay, who's still here who can help me? I don't know what, I'll just shut it down and she restores it?
Well, I'm going to go ahead because it's a slide that is not that difficult to understand. It is a slide that shows you that there are now more than 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And though we've seen that measure appear before, there we go. That measure appeared before for a few days or for a few hours, but for the whole month of March, the average global concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere has now been 400 parts per million for an entire month. The head scientist of NOAA was quoted as saying, "Reaching 400 parts per million as a global average is a significant milestone." That milestone is part of what has been described as a planetary scale critical transition, never before witnessed by human civilization. In the face of this kind of terrifying projection, anticipating the crossing of biophysical boundaries not meant to be crossed, what are we to hope for? We are headed into a territory we have never known, with little knowledge and no GPS. The more appropriate question seems to be, what should we fear? The question that comes more easily to mind is, what can we despair about? So I'm going to start with some gallows humor in the form of the advice of a Jew during the Holocaust. Save your despair for when you really need it. Gallows humor is by definition grim and ironic, mocking the immediate facts of a dire reality. You think this is bad? But it's not merely ironic. It's also a cheeky, insolent reminder of the tendency to despair too soon. The immediate situation is bad, even terrible, but the world might yet be different. To despair too soon is counterproductive. When do you really need despair? The implicit answer is not as long as there is a flicker of hope. Save your despair for when you really need it. Still, it's hard to know what we know about the state of the world and be hopeful. I awoke the other day to two messages in my email. One was an article reporting that 93% of seed varieties had been lost in the last 80 years. And the other was from the Greater Good Science Center with advice on how to learn to love your stress. To know what we know is to live between hope and despair, trying not to be immobilized by either. Let's see, oops, go back. The literary critic Raymond Williams once wrote, "To be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing." In her important new book, This Changes Everything: Capitalism versus the Climate, Naomi Klein makes the case that the climate crisis can become a catalyst for social and economic transformation. If treated as a true planetary emergency, she believes that climate change could become, quote, a galvanizing force for humanity, leaving us all not just safer from extreme weather, but with societies that are safer and fairer in all kinds of other ways as well. Klein devotes the last part of her book to examples of hope in action, what she calls blockadia. And these are effects of people across the world to preserve the integrity of their land communities by blocking the work of extractive industries. While I was writing this presentation, sorry about that. The Shell No Paddle in Seattle protest, a blockadia action, was underway in the Port of Seattle. The image was iconic. Thousands of small boats, kayaks, and tribal canoes filling the waterway, blocking massive drilling rigs from entering the port in order to ultimately block Arctic drilling further north. Klein distinguishes between optimism and hope, and it's an important distinction and one I'm sure you've heard before. She's not at all optimistic that we'll be able to keep the Earth's temperature from rising more than 2 degrees Celsius, nor is she confident that there is wisdom or will enough to prevent technophiles from dangerously toying with natural systems, or politicians from supercharged neoliberal policies crafted on behalf of their campaign funders. And yet, even so, she's been accused of being maddeningly optimistic by no less a personage than the environmental journalist Elizabeth Kolbert, author of, among other things, The Sixth Extinction: An Unnatural History. Kolbert accuses Klein of, quote, telling a fable she hopes will do some good. And Kolbert's cynicism cannot be dismissed out of hand. There is simply no cause to be confident that about the future when that last northern white rhino male has to be guarded 24 hours a day, or he and his entire species will be murdered for the price of his horn. There is no cause for confidence in the capacity of humans to respond effectively and compassionately to the 52 island nations now at risk of being swept away by rising sea levels. John Oliver, the satirist and social critic, says, and I have toned down his comment a bit, "We've proven that we cannot be trusted with the future tense. We've been repeatedly asked, don't you want to leave a better earth to your grandchildren? And we've all collectively responded, screw them." But Klein's response is equally deserving of attention. She says this, "I have yet to meet anyone professionally focused on the science of our warming planet who does not wrestle with despair, myself included. Yet surely the decision about whether to maintain some hope in the face of our existential crisis that is still technically preventable is not just a matter of cold calculation. It's also a question of ethics. If there's any chance of turning the tide, if taking action could actually lead to all kinds of ancillary benefits, then it seems to me that those of us with public platforms, and I know that's many of you in this room, have a responsibility to share that good news along all the painful truths. So, let us consider hope. I have a colleague from India. Her aunt lives on the 26th floor of a building in Calcutta. Her aunt has a bad hip, and there's only one lift in the building. The earthquake that hit Nepal so hard also made buildings in Calcutta shake and left large cracks in the concrete. So what will your aunt do? I asked my friend. Will she move? No, she answered, definitely not. There's nothing to be done. This is Calcutta. Her aunt is resigned to dying in the building should a strong enough quake hit her neighborhood again. Her hope is that despite the terrestrial geography, despite non-existent zoning codes, despite insufficient building codes, and despite the limitations of her own body, she hopes she will not meet her death on the 26th floor of her apartment building. She is fatalistic about her future. Hers is a wistful hope, a yearning restrained by the graceful acceptance that this is Calcutta. If wishes were horses, beggars would ride. In reaction to passive hope, Derek Jensen, a leading environmental activist and writer, urges us to move beyond hope. He writes, "Many people say they hope the dominant culture stops destroying the world. By saying that, they've assumed that the destruction will continue, and they've stepped away from their own ability to participate in shaping it. When we realize the degree of agency we actually do have, we no longer have to hope at all. We simply do the work. We make sure salmon survive. We make sure prairie dogs survive. We do whatever it takes." For Jensen, hope immobilizes action. To be hopeful is to be helpless. Jensen's reaction to hope as an excuse for irresponsibility is warranted. There is a kind of hope that leads to passivity. But it's not just hope that can cripple initiative. Pessimism and despair are equally liable to constrain action, and so are extreme forms of optimism. So there is nothing simple about hope. Take, for example, the radical and alarming hope of those who propose geoengineering as a solution to climate change. Theirs is a brew of total pessimism about human nature and our ability to overcome our carbon addiction, and total optimism in technology and our ability to manage the entire Earth system. Hope and its varieties are based on assumptions about what we're capable of doing and about what is important and possible. Those assumptions are often the outcome of unstated philosophical assumptions. I think it's telling that John Cobb formulated this plenary session, that when he formulated it, he didn't ask the question, is hope possible? Instead, he asked us to consider, what can we hope for? That question assumes that hope is possible, is feasible, despite the very grave circumstances that are the reason for this conference. As John wrote in a pre-conference essay, quote, "Our inaugural conference is based on the hope that hope will help." The reason why hope is feasible for someone like John Cobb is because it is part of a metaphysics that makes it so. That metaphysics is process thought. Process thought offers a way of understanding reality that makes radical hope possible. By radical hope, I mean hope that is sustained not simply by sheer force of personal conviction, or by willful ignorance of reality, or because of a privileged immunity from reality's worst contingencies. Radical hope is secured in its roots by a metaphysics. And that's a metaphysics that affirms change and possibility, agency and power, novelty and creativity, and value and importance. These are philosophical concepts that secure hope as something real, not to be dismissed, in spite of what we know about the depletion of topsoil, the death of coral reefs, the spill in Santa Barbara. Amidst this proliferation of tragedies, it is not naive, it's still not naive, to ask the question, what can we hope for? Because there is a process relational metaphysics in which certain things are possible, including hope, even in a time of mass extinctions, even in a time of ecocide. So let me spend a few minutes sketching the metaphysics of hope provided by process philosophy, and forgive me, all of you who are already familiar with this. First, the word process in process philosophy. Process describes, of course, the fundamental activity of the world. Everything is always in process, always undergoing some degree of change. And this is a slide from Antelope Canyon. If you haven't been there, I recommend going. And obviously, it's the process of erosion. Often this change is hardly perceptible, and so we experience a general stability of conditions. But change is the rule, and in this case, there are no exceptions. Change is, as Whitehead says, in the essence of the universe. Reality is a process of dynamic becoming, not static being. But though change is guaranteed, positive change is not. Unlike campaign rhetoric of recent years, change does not presuppose progress. Positive change is a possibility, but change can also be detrimental. Still, the fact that the world is in a constant state of change provides a foothold for hope, because it means that the status quo is ephemeral. Whitehead's explanation for the process of change is brilliant and complex. I am now going to reduce that brilliance and complexity to a very quick look at three principles reasons why change happens: possibility, agency, and value. Possibility. The idea of possibility requires the notion of potentiality. In a world that is in process, that is characterized by change, possibilities must abound, otherwise there's only repetition. But we know that novel ideas and new sensibilities do come into the world. Whitehead offers the example of the idea of freedom and individual self-determination, and he traces the history of slavery as an unchallenged, taken for granted practice in Plato's time to a deplorable, though still practiced, practice in the 21st century. Change happens, often slowly, often in unplanned cooperation with chance. It took millennia before human servitude was broadly recognized as an atrocity. But novelty builds on novelty. New insights replace old ones, and new patterns of behavior reinforce change. The future is conditioned by the past, but it's not determined by it. Though there are strong patterns of repetition, there is not sheer repetition. And this is because the facts of the world are supplemented by possibilities that are inherent in the world, waiting to be actualized. As Whitehead writes, and I wish he always wrote this evocatively, a great idea in the background of dim consciousness is like a phantom ocean beating upon the shores of human life in successive waves of specialization. A whole succession of such waves are as dreams slowly doing their work of sapping the base of some cliff of habit. But the seventh wave is a revolution. Agency. To be realized, possibilities must be incorporated into the lives of experiencing beings, into our lives. Whitehead affirms Plato's claim that to be is to have some degree of agency. The definition of being is simply power, he writes. Here, power means dynamism, the ability to achieve, to actively participate in the fundamental processes that shape reality. Rather than being an inanimate cog in a machine, each entity shapes its own existence to some degree, determining what weight will be given to the past and introducing its own unique aim into the final form. Each entity is an original event, a novel coalescence of factors. Human life is our most familiar illustration of what that means, but all entities are to some degree self-directed. Each of us has the capacity to reject destructive patterns and construct life-affirming ones. And there's so much hope in that statement. Each one of us has some degree of freedom, some degree of creativity, and that's why in its denial of this truth, slavery is so horrendous. To exercise our creativity is not always easy, and success is not always guaranteed. The givenness of the world is formidable. The past has a strong grip on the present, and often it seems that meaningful change is not possible. But the capacity is there. And that capacity is immanent in the natural order, as much a part of the metaphysical landscape as transpiration is a part of the water cycle. This agency, this power to participate in life actively and creatively, and not simply to replicate fixed behaviors and beliefs, is a pivot for hope. For the kind of hope that David Orr, a leading environmentalist, describes as a verb with its sleeves rolled up. Third, value. When we say that we hope things will be different, we imply that they ought to be different, and we reveal hope's ethical dimension. Hope's deepest grounding is in a metaphysics that affirms value as inherent in the structure of reality. Process metaphysics provides such a metaphysical system. Indeed, according to process philosophy, value is inherent in actuality itself. Whitehead writes, and I love this line, "Our enjoyment of actuality is a realization of worth, good or bad. It is a value experience." The whole process of becoming is directed toward the grasping of value in others, the incorporation of it within ourselves, and the furtherance of value in creative ways. And the process of each actuality and of life in general is toward attaining value, increasing value, and enjoying value. Above all, what is valued is this. A second. The simple craving to enjoy freely the vividness of life. I love that phrase, to enjoy freely the vividness of life. Surely this is what we hope for, in the most general sense, to freely and truly engage in life. There is much more that can be said about how a process metaphysics gives grounds for hope. Truth, goodness, and beauty, for example, lend their support to the experience of life's vividness. How worth is secured in each actuality occupies most of Whitehead's magnum opus, Process and Reality. But for now, I hope my point is clear, that process philosophy secures the idea of hope metaphysically. Without this kind of mooring, hope floats like driftwood, lightweight and eroding. Instead of being a stimulus for engagement, it becomes nothing more than wishful thinking. With metaphysical support, hope is possible not only as the consequence of individual passion, not solely dependent on whether people have the capacity to beckon and sustain it, but because it is the outcome of a worldview illuminated by possibility, agency, novelty, and worth. And so, at last, some reflections on what we can hope for. Years ago, Donella Meadows, author of the now classic book, The Limits to Growth, led a series of workshops focused on how to end hunger. And she invited expert agronomists and economists, ecologists, development specialists to her workshop. Meadows began the first workshop by asking the question, what is your vision of a world without hunger? What's your vision of a world without hunger? She asked people to describe, quote, not the world they thought they could achieve or the world they were willing to settle for, but the world they truly wanted. People refused to answer her question, and some called it stupid and dangerous. Someone said, we don't need to talk about what the end of hunger will be like. We need to talk about how to get there. Someone else told her to stop being unrealistic. She pressed them anyway. Eventually, people began to let their defenses down. She writes, one person said with emotion that he couldn't stand the pain of thinking about the world he really wanted when he was so aware of the world's present state. And finally, one person voiced what Meadows describes as coming closer to the truth than any of our other rationalizations. I have a vision, this person said, but it would make me feel childish and vulnerable to say it out loud. Why is it, asked Meadows, that we can share our cynicism, our complaints, and our frustrations without hesitation with perfect strangers, but we can't share our dreams? How did we arrive at a culture that constantly, almost automatically ridicules visionaries? When were we taught, and by whom, to suppress our visions? I think it's fair to say that modern education is partly to blame, having promoted objectivity as its primary value, critical thinking as its primary method, and career placement as its primary aim. But visions and hopes are fueled by values, by what we judge to be important and hold to be of worth. If we don't have a vision, if we aren't honest about our real desires, and if we aren't willing to share them publicly, we end up with half-baked policies and strategies for implementation. As British environmental writer George Monbiot said, we need a vision that, quote, proposes a better world rather than, if we work really hard for it, just a slightly less shitty one than there would otherwise have been. In answer to John Cobb's 1971 question, it may be too late to avoid ecological and social catastrophe. After all, the Club of Rome was right. There are ecological limits to economic and population growth. On the other hand, what can we hope for is a question about vision, about what we value and how we will direct our energies. Meadows wrote her essay Envisioning a Sustainable World in 1994, slightly more than 20 years after her report to the Club of Rome. To call for vision is to call for possibility and agency within a framework of values. It is, in other words, a practice of hope. I've asked the chairs of the other tracks in our section on ecological civilization to reflect on the question, what can we hope for, from their perspectives, and in a minute they're going to come up and offer us their thoughts. But I'll close this presentation with a few of my own. Reading of Hard Landings, that will be the end of civilization, and soft landings that are nonetheless sobering, I find myself in a kind of intoxicated dialectic, reeling between hope and despair. The Palestinian peace activist Ali Abu Awad speaks of painful hope, and I think that's a good term for describing the kind of hope that combines vision with activism, and his is a vision I deeply support. My vision is informed by Whitehead's insight that all beings aim toward the simple craving, the simple craving to enjoy freely the vividness of life. Most of us, rich and poor, in fat countries and lean ones, don't enjoy the vividness of life to the degree that we might. Burdened in the one case with too much material goods and too little time, and in the other case with too few of life's necessities and too much insecurity. To speak of the vividness of life is to speak in aesthetic terms, and I would be remiss if I didn't speak about beauty as vision and hope. To do so, to speak about beauty in our modern world is to court dismissal. It is to hear the voice of that participant in Donella Meadows' workshop who said, "Stop being ridiculous." But our continued trivialization of beauty is evidence of the unremitting grip of the modern worldview on us. Philosophical and economic materialism required the marginalizing of beauty. Just so, a reintroduction of beauty as a public value will serve to break the exclusive control of economics as the determiner of worth. If we are to move toward a paradigm that supports life and that is ecologically sound, I believe we must commit to beauty as a central value and organizing principle. For Whitehead, the simple craving to enjoy freely the vividness of life is an aesthetic aim and involves an aesthetic process. The production of art is one expression of this drive, but Whitehead is talking about the production of life. To hope for beauty is to hope for a world alive with biodiversity, with cultural diversity, with great diversity of life, the consequence of endless creativity. And it is to hope for the coordination of life forms to life forms so that each individual life is able to enjoy the details of its own life and to be supported by and contribute to the larger structures of relations. Right now, we have made many parts of the world ugly, dreadful places. And actually, Uga is from the Norse. The etymological background of the word ugly is from the Norse word uga, for dread, dreadful places. Albertus tar sands, this is mountaintop removal. And these are those fracking pads I just flew over in my flight from North Carolina. On the one hand, we have outsized corporations in which the whole does not support the parts, depriving them of their individual intensities. And in regard to our human relations with the natural world, we have a part, human civilization, especially capitalist civilization, asserting itself as the whole and destroying both the many parts and the processes on which it depends. In our drive to promote human life, we have denied the worth of other life forms. Beauty, understood as the name for the value associated with aliveness, calls us to a different relation with the natural world and each other. It is on this different relation that we need and can build our hope. Naomi Klein and writer-activist Rebecca Solnit are vocal about the need for a coalescence of activist movements. It's all the same conversation, says Klein. That's why her book on climate change is also a book on capitalism. Climate change is transition activism, and both are justice activism. To create a movement of movements is an aesthetic project, the value and vitality of each individual effort, each mobilization for justice, each boycott or occupation, each legal challenge is affirmed both in its singularity and in its importance for the whole effort to shape the common good. Each effort is one exquisite detail in the emergence of a larger composition whose significance and worth reinforces the value of the individual efforts on which it depends. Whitehead's primary example of beauty is the cathedral at Chartres, with its 9 portals lined with statues. He says, there are these statues, each with its individual beauty, and all leading themselves to the beauty of the whole. So it might be with a movement of movements, a dynamic mutuality between individual efforts, I guess I could go backwards, and the great restructuring to which they contribute. The contributions of individuality to the whole, and of the whole to the constitution of each individual. This is the dynamic core of Whitehead's philosophy. How it might best be achieved involves, I think, localism and local scale, the rebuilding of community life where individuals understand themselves as individuals in community and regard themselves as members of a place in relationship with the land community. In short, it involves restructuring our social lives in ways that strengthen our sense of belonging and our obligations to those with whom we live and the places where we live. These are the possibilities that I believe will renew our individual agency and restore a sense of worth to our relations to each other. Let me close with an anecdote recounted by Rebecca Solnit. It's the story of a woman, and I'm afraid she doesn't name the woman, and I don't know who this woman was. But this woman was involved in the anti-nuclear movement of the 1960s called Women's Strike for Peace. And that movement actually succeeded in ending above-ground nuclear testing. In her reflections, the woman spoke about, she said, that how foolish and futile she felt standing in the rain one morning protesting at the Kennedy White House. But years later, she learned that Dr. Benjamin Spock, the well-known anti-war activist who became a leader in the nuclear disarmament movement, became active in the nuclear movement because he had seen a small group of women standing in the rain protesting at the White House. That, he said, was his turning point. Solnit writes, it's always too soon to calculate effect. This story, this lesson is for us gathered at this conference. Perhaps 5 years or 10 or 20 years from now, people will remember this gathering in Claremont, in the middle of that drought in California, just after that oil spill north of Santa Barbara. And they will think about all those people who chose to make their hope active, to seize alternatives to the destructive practices of late modernity. People from all over the U.S., that great delegation from China, and others from far and wide. And they will say, that was my turning point. That was our turning point. The reason why we persist in our hope that we can change the world. Thank you. Yeah, so let me invite the leaders of the track sections up to speak for a few minutes.
Let me give the names while they're going on.
Okay. I'm not sure everyone's here.
So the track sections, number one is, number one track in
It's going to be Jean Myers.
okay, Jean Myers is going to give that report, and Jean Nakamura is the the track leader. And Sandra Lubarsky has given her report is track 2. Track 3, Marilyn Hempel, Population and Women. Track 4, Breanne Donaldson, Seizing and the Future of Meat and Animals. Or, excuse me, the Future of Meat Without Animals. Dean Fordenberger, track 5, Our Ecology as a foundational, I guess, fundamental for ecological civilization, and Barbara Maraca, and you have a co-facilitator, Fabian Young, and that is a bilingual track, Birth Pangs of an Ecological Civilization, and finally the track 7, Mandarin Language Only, is China and an Ecological Civilization. So why don't we just start with the first track.
Thank you. Thank you, Sandra. It's a hard act to follow. I'm Gene Myers. I'm speaking on behalf of Track 1, and particularly Mike Csikszentmihalyi and Jean Nakamura from Claremont Graduate University, who've been point on that, particularly Jean. So the topic of our track is the psychology of well-being and its ecological implications. So in a sense, it's an attempt to adapt the scientific method to ground and unpack some of the central abstractions that we've looked at from process point of view in evidence of the human mind and the human lived experience. So actually our track is an incubator where we have invited about 2/3 of the participants early career and another third more senior folks to find the intersections between the areas of conservation psychology, which I've been very involved in, similar to environmental psychology, eco-psychology, and positive psychology, which Jean and Mike and many other people have been developing in the last decade and a half. So positive psychology is concerned with human strengths and virtues, well-being, and developmental potentials beyond the merely probable. Conservation psychology is the use of psychological techniques and research to understand and promote a healthy relationship between humans and the natural environment. When Mike Csikszentmihalyi and Marty Seligman produced a founding document about positive psychology, they said that the disease model had dominated psychology to some extent, but it had not moved psychology closer to prevention of serious problems. Rather, they said, what has helped has largely come from a perspective focused on systematically building competency, not correcting weakness. So the same spirit needs to be applied perhaps for environmental problems. I teach environmental studies, and I see this in my students, and of course it's part of our society's standpoint about environmental issues. We see ourselves as the problem. We're the species that messed up. And the cause seems to be our self-concept as being separate and above from nature. So there doesn't seem to be much hope. And things coming out of Hollywood movie studios with a dystopian flavor seem to reinforce that. However, that's not a good portrayal of what the psychology is telling us. So I'm going to just briefly try to touch on some of the themes that we'll be addressing in our strand. From the conservation psych side, we have a growing body of evidence demonstrating many beneficial effects of immediate interaction with nature: physical health, lowered blood pressure, stress reduction, increased concentration, restored executive function, impulse control, reduction in ADHD symptoms, lowered hostility, depression and anxiety, mood elevation, increased reflection on life and faith, and creativity. That's just some of the things that have been found. We have evidence that even the best available technologically simulated nature has less benefit of those sorts than real nature. Researchers are investigating the relation of biodiversity and measures of well-being, and there are a half dozen measures that have been developed to understand people's feeling of connectedness to nature. That variable turns out to be related to emotional well-being, mindfulness, pro-social behaviors, and sensitivity to natural beauty. So the psychological reality is not that we are separate from nature. It is very much part of us. We're very much part of it, and an important part of well-being. What about the popular fatalism about humans' relationship to nature? Psychology helps us stand back from this and question the question. Hope, optimism, and pessimism are subjects of scientific study in psychology. People's ways of explaining negative or positive events to themselves vary in terms of several factors, according to one theory. For example, we might view an event as having been due to external versus internal factors. Those factors could be stable or unstable, and they could be global versus specific. So if a negative event is examined as, or explained to myself as due to factors that are internal, stable, and global, such as I'm such an idiot, or we're inherently greedy, that would connote pessimistic explanatory point of view. And that would tend to reduce our efforts to change our own behavior in order to avoid the experience in the future. An optimistic explanation, it would instead focus on external factors that are perceived as specific and changeable, such as I was misinformed, or there's a lot of particular things that can be addressed. So the optimistic point of view here, and with regard to the difference between optimism and hope, would it would help us decompose our problems. And I've seen this in the climate change movement. For example, Kaya Chatterjee's work in the Climate Network she has people in every little niche of society who are working on it, and you listen to her and you go, wow, this is great. Same with Bill McKibben's work, of course. This supports incremental small wins, fostering a sense of competence, choosing goals, focusing on opportunities, increasing the belief that one can do useful actions, and that working together to achieve larger effects than one can alone is a very powerful experience and worth celebrating. We've also looked at, we have researchers in our community that have looked at committed environmentalists, and the problem of negativism is compounded. And we've had reference to this throughout this talk so far. Committed environmentalists who know nature well and have experienced harm to it show persistent and debilitating negative emotions. And so it's as if they're experiencing a mentally mediated trauma that threatens hope. And they suppress the expression of those feelings because they're not socially acceptable. And instead may actually, like other trauma victims, reenact or pass along the distress in the way that they communicate about planetary crisis. So the big challenge that some folks are looking at is how that grief and pain can be more effectively acknowledged and worked through. It's a very significant question, and then how that changes the way we communicate about it. So briefly, our track also is exploring alternatives. I'm reminded of the parable I heard probably as a child about the sun and the wind betting who could, I'm going to modify the story a bit, I'm out of time. Okay. Who can get the woman to take off her coat best? The wind tries to blow it off. That's the negative approach. The sun warms her up. So apropos of that, we're looking at positive emotion, self-determination theory, competence, belongingness, autonomy, autonomously motivated action, and other positive routes towards motivating change. So, thank you.
I'm the chair of the Women in Population track. Before I start, I would like to take a moment, just a brief moment, to thank our honored Chinese guests for taking this long journey to be here today. In 2000, I was very lucky to be part of a United Nations-sponsored tour that visited family planning clinics all over China. The clinics were not just medical, which was a surprise to me. They were community centers that helped people in many ways, teaching everything from computer skills to better farming techniques. In a Shanghai clinic, there was even a class for grandparents to teach them how not to spoil their grandchild. I thought this was particularly funny because I think that spoiling my grandchild is one of my major jobs. The Chinese can be very proud of their 5,000 years of history and their willingness to act for the common good. I wish more Americans would act for the common good. Welcome, you have much to teach us. I'm going to talk briefly about what I call the long emergency and why numbers of people and what they do are so important. What I say may sound shocking, but in a world where people are causing the extinction of so many other lives, and where humans are even altering the climate, it has become way too serious for sweet words. The reality is, without population stabilization and lowering consumption, there is no hope for a sustainable future. No blueprint for a sustainable society that excludes population stabilization will succeed. A few facts. It took all of human history until about 1800 for the world to have 1 billion people. That's more than 200,000 years to reach the first billion people. In 1920, there were 2 billion. By 1999, there were 6 billion. Now there are more than 7.3 billion with no stopping in sight. By far, the most extraordinary event in the 20th century was exponential human population growth. Population will stop growing because on a finite planet, nothing grows forever. The only question is, will it stop growing because we provided free family planning services to all people, or because we let war, famine, failed states, and plagues take their toll? But it's not just about the numbers. Another and even more extraordinary fact. Since 1940, Americans have consumed more goods, services, and therefore natural resources than all other people in all of human history combined. That's extraordinary. Americans have consumed more than all other people in all of human history combined. If everyone consumed the way Americans do, we would need at least 4 more planet Earths to support us. Add to that the highly successful export of the American consumptive lifestyle around the world, including to China and India. China and India between them host more than 2.5 billion people, about 1/3 of the world's total population. Unfortunately for the planet, it is so easy for all of us to be sucked into the consumption trap. Scientific studies and ecological footprint studies show that at a modest European consumption level, about half the consumption of Americans, the Earth could sustainably support about 2 to 3 billion people. So we now know that the extractive, industrial, capitalist society is unsustainable. Growth is not God, but many people and governments worship growth. The planet is in crisis. It is exactly in the long emergency that we most need to have a clear idea of what kind of society we want and where we want to be at the end of the crisis. Don't wait until the crisis is over to decide. It is now that we should use the opportunity of the crisis to think and plan creatively for the future of civilization. Not a civilization as we know it, a new resolve, keeping in mind that old habits will die hard. It is now that we need clear ideas and plans and actions for what a sustainable world could be, and most importantly, a plan for how we are going to get from here to there. Part of that action involves changing ourselves internally, as we've heard today, our mindsets and how we perceive our place in and our relationship with nature. Part of that action involves changing the structure and practices of society, education, economy, agriculture, and so on. World leaders like to ignore the population factor, but we do so at our peril. The United Nations estimates that some 400 million women want family planning services but have no access. The cost is estimated at $17 billion a year. Considering the amount of money the world spends on wars, for example, the US government has spent over $2 trillion on the Iraq war alone, and it isn't over. No one can say that reproductive health care for women is unaffordable or unattainable. Yet I have heard national and world leaders argue just that. We who work in the population, environment, and family planning fields, as we see states fail and death rates rise, are haunted by the words from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We are faced with the fact, my friends, that tomorrow is today. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residues of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, "Too late." Are any of us willing to look our grandchildren in the face and say, "Too late"? If not, we must begin here, begin now to live sustainable lives in every way we can. There are numerous roadmaps to follow. There are numerous ways that will get us from our unsustainable ways on the road to a better, not bigger future. Join us in our track. We have brochures and books that offer many solutions. Thank you.
Good afternoon, I'm Brian Donaldson. My track is Human-Animal Relations. At the Smithfield Farmland Pig Slaughterhouse in the small rural Illinois town where I've been living and teaching the last year, they like to say that they use everything but the squeal. Yet for me and our track on human-animal relations that will examine a future of meat without animals, the squeal of resistance is the exact starting point, because hope often begins in despair. Now, every day at that local slaughterhouse, 10,000 intelligent and sensitive creatures are trucked through heat and rain and snow, approximately 55,000 a week, 3 million a year, into the heart of town in plain sight. From the adjacent shopping center parking lot, you can easily hear the pigs' screams in their final resistance to a short lifetime of industrial standard brutality as they are offloaded into gas chambers primarily by immigrant hands, Africans who've won the work visa lottery, Burmese Christian religious refugees, and Latino immigrants staff the kill floor. 14 languages are spoken at our slaughterhouse there, forming a migration circuit with 3 other slaughterhouses within 100 miles. Now, living in proximity to the realities of this slaughterhouse sheds a bleak light on the state of industrial agriculture, which is not decreasing, but it is increasing in scope. This may seem counterintuitive because in the US, meat consumption just slightly per capita is on a slight downward trend, just so slightly per person. Yet international markets like India and China drive demand for cheap US meat, which is cheap because feed grains like corn and soy are heavily subsidized by the government and taxpayers, and thus farmers are incentivized to grow these crops over all others. And it's so cheap, in fact, to breed and raise and kill animals in the US because of these subsidized grain prices that it's actually cheaper for China to import US meat as well as grains than to grow them itself. For this reason, in late 2014, Smithfield, the owner of the slaughterhouse in my town and the biggest pork producer in the world, was purchased by a Chinese firm for $5 billion, the biggest takeover of a US company in history. And likewise, a Chinese firm recently bought the local granary in town that grinds, weighs, and stores corn and soy. So while there are some decreasing trends in the US meat consumption and some substantial increases in those who primarily eat plant-based foods, the trucks of pigs are actually projected to increase in my town. America's heartland is increasingly becoming Chinese-owned, feeding demand across the globe in slaughterhouses that are run by economic immigrants and religious refugees. And it is a fairly despairing picture, and yet hope often begins with despair, and that is where our track, looking at the future of meat without animals, will jump off. We're going to be looking at the rise of plant-based meat over the 20th and 21st century, but especially the last 5 years, when wealthy millionaire and billionaire investors like Bill Gates, the founders of Twitter, Google Ventures, have offered unprecedented investment in plant-based meat, dairy, and egg alternatives, not as a niche market product for a few ethical vegetarians, but as a mass market alternative that can be scaled and scaled quickly for a global population, produced and sold at a price that can undercut the falsely cheap cost of meat and eggs. The new animal activist in many ways is wearing a lab coat, blending amino acids, proteins, and molecular structures to perfectly match the aesthetic experience of meat at a lower cost than animal flesh. Likewise, we can look to companies like Hampton Creek Foods, funded by Chinese billionaire Li Ka-shing, to create eggless cookies, pancakes, eggless mayonnaise, and a full-on scrambled egg alternative, because China is currently ingesting 1.3 billion eggs a day and projecting to grow that to closer to 2 billion a day. Many investors believe that this is a system that will self-destruct, and so we see in the example of the recent bird flu epidemic, companies like Hampton Creek stepping into a gap, collaborating with industry giants, small-scale companies for egg alternatives in thousands of products. Now, briefly, one main difference here in our track is the moral starting point. Historically, plant-based eating, being vegetarian or vegan, has been driven by moral arguments against the needless suffering and killing of our fellow planetary creatures. The motivation to be more moral is important, but it's also problematic. It's important because one must speak the sacred no in the face of grievous destruction, violence, and exploitation of creatures, neighbors, and planetary systems, what Whitehead calls our buzzing planetary democracy. But the moral drive is also problematic because it suggests that if we were only good people, then the bad would somehow disappear. If we were better people, then the world would be better. The new generation of heavily funded plant-based meats and eggs, though perhaps privately driven by these moral sentiments, does not ask how to create a new generation of moral superheroes, but rather how to take just ordinary people and incentivize better action in different structures that factor in wider swaths of life from the start. Perhaps controversially, there is no requirement in this perspective for behavioral change totally. Merely a substitution of a much better choice that is so easy to make, accessible, affordable, environmentally feasible, that it would be an illogical extra effort not to make it. As a track, The Future of Meat Without Animals is a functional think tank, and we're bringing together people to look at the potentials and the pitfalls of a future of meat without animals, meaning a future of scalable, affordable, delicious, nutritionally identical, and aesthetically familiar plant-based alternatives. We aim to produce the first systematic, multidisciplinary published volume, as well as open access online outputs, looking at this topic from environment, plant philosophy, ethics, gender, class, race, economics, Chinese, Indian perspectives, agricultural history, religion, art, and transportation. We take as a starting point that the current structures of food did not fall from on high, and they can be built anew. And the future of meat without animals hopes to contribute to that imaginative construction. Thank you.
My name is Dean Freudenberger. I've been in the field of international agriculture for 85 years minus 14. Very briefly, I'm the organizer for the track called Agroecology as foundational for ecological civilization. Our problem is simply that we're running out of soil. The United Nations Agriculture Organization predicts right now as do other institutions, that worldwide we're losing 1% of our topsoil per year. Where does that leave us at the end of the century? And of course, without soil and without food, there is no civilization. It's that basic. Our track will explore 4 areas. We will explore the many aspects of agroecology. We hardly know what that really means and what that involves. Secondly, we raised the question, is it possible for agriculture to mimic the dynamics of natural systems? Wes Jackson will be helping us a great deal at that point. Thirdly, how will we better understand the dynamics between living soil and plants? And you can't have pigs or anything without vegetation of various kinds. And we hardly know at this stage of the game the dynamics between the maintenance of soil fertility and the sustenance of plant life itself. We're really having to go back in this modern high-tech world. We're having to go back to look at some very basic questions of which right now we have no answers. And finally, sustainability and resource regeneration, that is soil fertility, is foundational for an ecological civilization. It's that basic. I'm responding to Sandra's presentation on a Whiteheadian understanding of hope, and I have 4 sentences here where, as I ponder this over these many decades and the issues that we're facing, such as the one that we have just heard described. Number 1, our hope in all of this is the growing understanding that we must seek an alternative way to relate to planet Earth. Our agriculture has not figured that out. We have been working at the issue of problem awareness now for nearly 50 years. We are making progress. This conference demonstrates that fact. So as we've been working at these issues for nearly 50 years now, we're finally beginning to generate some public awareness. Secondly, our hope in all of this complexity and need for a whole new way of thinking, our hope is in a new generation of committed leadership. We see that. I live here in Claremont at Pilgrim Place now in retirement, and we work closely with the 5 colleges and the graduate university here and the School of Theology. And as we relate to new generations of young people coming off the academic assembly line, there's a lot of hope in that. Thirdly, our hope is in the expansion or the vision that Sandra was talking about. Our hope is in the vision of a science of agroecology. That term has been around for a long time, but we haven't fleshed it out. And finally, our hope is now in our concern, generally, globally speaking, our hope now is in the concern for the health of the planet itself and how the health and the welfare of humanity is dependent upon planetary stability. Agriculture, along with climate change issues and population growth, and finally the reductance of biological diversity. Those 4 issues have to be addressed and solved in our time. And something we don't talk about, and I have been pushing for my career, is without soil, there is no civilization, and we have yet as a civilization to understand the stress that humanity has placed on a very limited resource upon which we are all dependent. So our track will really be talking about the question, is it possible to develop a regenerative food system?
Well, then I will not say in details what we're doing in my track, which is the 6th track, Birthplace of Ecological Civilization, but I will address the issue of hope. Just a few words. The term ecological civilization is intended in my track, in our track, as a larger concept, because from all over the world, people are starting questioning the way we understand our relation between society and nature, and it calls with different names. We have sustainable development, ecological civilization, biocivilization, which is a term that especially indigenous people from Latin America have been using, and we will explore these different traditions. We will explore different perspectives for change, including education for sustainable development, and we will be very international. We have speakers from Brazil, Germany, Mexico, China. Did I forget something? And of course, the US and Australia too, exactly. So that will be a very international set. It's a hope of its own. One of these perspectives about an alternative path to ecological civilization is also something that I have been working on in the last year, which is called degrowth, which is directly attacking and addressing economic growth as the wrong model for civilization. And I would like to share with you just one thought of my own experience. I had the privilege to preparing the conference that we had in Germany last year in September, Degrowth for Ecological Sustainability and Social Equity, which was an incredible conference organized by young people. I was the grandma, everybody was under 30. This gives hope. A large number of very young people organizing a conference, consensus-based and basic democratic, that was for me an incredible experience, an incredible power for hope. We had 3,000 participants, and the large majority were below 30 years old, just to give you the hope. And we have 7,000 people participating online and to the conference, because we couldn't host more than 3,000 because it's just the room wasn't there for that. Drawing on that, I'm going to read a few sentences about hope. Most people at the Degrowth conference see in the crisis that we are facing a great chance to start changing things in a more radical way. For them, degrowth is not simply coping with shrinking the economy in a literal sense, but requires a radical transformation of the basis institutions of our society in order to render them independent from the growth addiction. The challenge is how to build a just, solidary, and democratic society that is no longer dependent on economic growth for its stabilization and legitimation. In times of crisis, like the one we are experiencing, established beliefs and commonly accepted justifications of our action start shivering, and here is the chance for change. When, for example, the promise of prosperity attached to growth stops working, as was the case in this country during the financial crisis and after that, we are faced with a contradiction between the meaning we used to attach to our actions, work hard, and you will get a better position in society, and their actual outcome. Institutions lose their legitimation. This is a time of danger and a chance for change at the very same time. For social transformation, we have to challenge our common social imaginary. The social imaginary changes when we start shifting the meaning of established values. We don't really need to reverse or reject established value. It is about a slow and subversive move of reinterpretation of established value. Just think, for example, of the values of freedom and autonomy in the global north, or in America for that matter. It is taken to mean individual freedom and arbitrariness in shaping one's own personal lifestyle. And yet, it bears in itself the potential for the idea of collective autonomy and can be re-signified, reread, reinterpreted to mean reclaiming the capacity to decide about the conditions of our common living and not only about our lifestyles. Social struggles and for emancipation and against discrimination and a bunch of different social experiments going on all over the world can be the leverage for transforming the shared imaginary. And I would call these social experiments to be concrete utopias. As concrete utopias, they anticipate future possibilities and already contribute to create a space in which this possibility can be experienced, lived, and tasted. They are prefigurative, they anticipate the future, prophetic and performative. They are laboratories where social innovation is literally forged and where people participating in them can find there the power and the motivation for resisting, building alliances, and continuing the transformation in other areas of life. Other than an abstract utopia that is merely wishful thinking, a concrete utopia envisions the real possible, what is already slumbering in the meanders of our actual world. This is why concrete utopia needs what Bloch, another old master, like Whitehead would like it as well, calls a militant optimism that is different from a naive hope for change. It means identifying the potentials and tendencies for transformation that are hidden in the present time and actively seizing them and rendering them visible. In other words, acting is a kind of catalyst enzyme that makes them stronger. And I conclude, concrete utopias have both a prophetic and a performative power. They envision alternative imaginaries, no matter how hidden behind these TINA narratives, there is no alternative narratives, they might be. Alternative imaginaries are embedded in the contradictions of the present, and they follow a kind of an and yet logic. The real is open. Whatever is, bears more in it than what is actually realized. That's Whitehead. Concrete utopias are spaces in which we can collectively learn about our desires, the true desires. We can provisionally suspend and thus start questioning pseudo-desires and the satisfaction of needs imposed by the existing structures. But for starting a serious debate about needs and desires, we need protected areas where we can experience and test alternatives. And these are the current social experiments going on all over the world. From there, we start struggling for a good life as a common, collective project of autonomy. Thank you.
Oh, thanks to all of our track leaders, and I do just want to leave with one thought. I had to give a small commencement address in May, and I also referred to Tina, and I challenged my students who are graduating to come up with a different acronym. And I challenge all of you, the best I could do, well, it's really actually kind of a challenge, is hundreds of possibilities exist, hope. But I think there's many more than hundreds, so please work on that acronym. And thank you all for coming, and I hope it's a really marvelous next few days. I know Charlene wants to say a few words just to direct you to the next piece of things.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sandra, and all the presenters from the different tracks. So what's next is lunch, and right after lunch, or not right after, you have about an hour and a half. At 2 o'clock, you'll all go into now your tracks, the first track session. It's the first track session of 8 sessions. Each track has 8 sections. And many of you have your program, and I believe you know where you're going. Jean Nakamura, track 1, is in the Smith Campus Center. And the rest of the tracks, Sustainable Practice, Sandra Lubarsky, Marilyn Hempel's Population and Women, Breanne Donaldson, Seizing the Alternative, The Future of Meat Without Animals, Dean Freudenberg, aeroecology as foundational to ecological civilization, 202, and Barbara Maraca, 203, all in Pearson. So we're going to have a nice little community in Pearson. And we have 3 volunteers. Where are our volunteers? There'll be a volunteer assigned to each one of these tracks, and they'll be checking in with you. Jacqueline Chase and Hugh Wire. Hugh's right here, stand up. And Terry Donnelly. So they'll be in Pearson. If you have questions of where to go or what room to show up in, they can help you. Our Mandarin-only language course is going to be in Pitzer College, and I think they all know where they're going to be. So if you have any questions, you can ask me afterwards, but we'll see you all at 2 o'clock, and most of you will be showing up in Pearson, which actually, if you come out of the dining room and you walk down the 6th Street, you'll take a right and go about 2 blocks, and it'll be, you'll take a left, and you'll end up at Pearson. It's a beautiful, older building, but very comfortable, and I think you'll enjoy it. Thank you all for being here, and have a very good lunch.